Now we'll throw a special case into the scenario. What if we had a train, a special train, an express train, that starts later? Let's add a train that isn't one of the regular running trains, but it also is not a non-operational train because it will start at noon. It's a special train. To do this in our code, we will need the else-if syntax. That's for when two conditions just is not enough. So let's take a look at that. We already know our if block, where if some condition is true, we're going to do some code. Now, the else if comes in when we need an extra condition to check before we fall to the final else block. You can see that in the else if block, if some other condition is true, we will do the code inside that particular block before we will allow the code to proceed down to the else block. Something to remember is that if any condition is ever met inside the if block or in the else if block, the else will never get evaluated. Else if allows us to check multiple conditions. It can be used when many specific scenarios need attention. So let's take a look at how we might apply the else if block to our special train situation. Here we have our normal, if the train number is less than or equal to the operational trains, let's just go ahead and print that that train is running. But now we need to check something specific. Otherwise, first check if the train is the express train. Then we want to print that train number 10 begins running at noon because it has its own special message. Otherwise, we know it is neither a running train nor an express train, and so it is a not operational train. How can we implement that particular part of the else if statement? Well, all we have to do is ask whether the train number is exactly equal to 10. If it is, we know it's train 10, and we can print out that that particular train is running at noon. Something to note is that the else if condition is never evaluated at all if the very first condition in the if block is checked and is satisfied. Similarly, the else block will only trigger when the above two blocks have failed. So now let's update our system status loop with our cool new else if statement. We can print based on multiple conditions now. So you can see that in our for loop, most of which you've seen before, we've added in the else if statement to check to see whether we have train number 10 and then print out that it runs at noon. So let's go through the execution board again and see exactly when that else if block is triggered. You can see that for the first 8 trains, that else if is completely ignored because the if block is triggered. And then on train number 9, since 9 is not equal to train number 10, we go straight to the else block and print the 9th train is not operational. On the 10th train, finally we have triggered our else if block and we see the printout that train number 10 begins running at noon. And then the rest of the trains proceed as normal and the loop stops at train 13. Sometimes when we check a condition, we need to check another condition inside that block before we continue with the code. A nested conditional will help us do that. Let's say we had some shapes. We got 2 sizes for squares, and we got 1 size for circles. We want to color big squares red and small squares blue. And since there's only 1 size circle, we'll color that purple. How can we do that in pseudocode? How can we make the decision as to whether a shape should be colored red, blue, or purple? Well, we know that if it's a square, we should check whether it is big. If it is big, we want to make that square red. Now, if it is not big, we will move straight into the else block, which means it must be a small square, and so we should make it blue. Now, this extra else down here on the bottom is going to take care of our circle. Why? Because we know that if our shape is not a square, it must be a circle. And so therefore we're going to make that purple. This is an example of nested conditionals. Something to note here is that the innermost else block only responds to the innermost if block. Additionally, the very last else block only responds to that first if conditional that checks whether the shape is a square. Say that in our train system, we wanted to print out a special message to our users that said whether all trains were running or none of them are. we can use nested conditionals to check whether we have all trains running or none. How can we demonstrate that kind of situation in pseudocode? Let's take a look. So if there are any running trains, meaning any running trains at all, the first thing we want to do is check to see if the amount of running trains is the amount of total trains. And then we want to print out to the passengers that all trains are running if that is true. Otherwise, we'll just execute our normal loop code to decide whether we have a running train or a not running train or a special train. And then outside all of that nested conditional, we'll have that final else block that says there must be no running trains, and so we will print that out. How do we know that? Well, if the very first if statement fails, that means there's no running trains, and so we can go straight to the else block and print out that there are no running trains. So let's check out how we would make some code out of that situation. Well, in our first if conditional, we would say if the train's operational is greater than 0. That means we have some running trains today. If that's true, then the first thing we need to check is whether the train's operational, meaning the amount of running trains, is equal to the total trains. If that's true, then of course we know that all of the trains are running, and so we can print that out to the user. Otherwise, then we run our basic for loop that we have already designed to differentiate between the running trains, the not running trains, and our special train. And then on the very last else block, we will know that there are no operational trains, and so we can print to the user that no trains are operational today. Bummer. So now if we update our trains.js file with our special new nested conditionals, our passengers will know whether all of the trains are running today, or whether none are, or whether it's a mix of the two. Something to note here is that all of our code is very efficient because it's controlled by just 2 variables. Let's see what would happen as we trace through our crazy nested conditional code. Let's see how we'd get these particular situations where we'd have all trains running or none. Well, first we know that we have 12 total trains, right? And we also have, in this particular case, 12 operational trains. They equal each other. Well, we know that the train's operational variable is greater than 0, so we will move into the very first if block. And then we will check to see if the train's operational variable is the exact same as the total trains variable. In this case it is, and so we will instantly print out that all trains are running at the JavaScript Express. Woohoo! Now, what would happen if we set our train's operational variable to 0? That means we have no running trains today. It must be a holiday. So now we'll come down and we'll say, is train's operational greater than 0? It is not. And so we will move straight to printing no trains are operational today, bummer, in the final else block.